what do we see when we look at each other's faces? And how can a poet or a painter help us to see the face behind the face? These are some of the questions I'm excited to discuss with the painter Pam Ingalls in this conversation about the classical Tamar masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Tirukural, or in short, the Kural. I'm Thomas Satoshi Pruxma, and it's been a humbling honor to have translated the Tirukural, the Kural, into English. And because this is a work that speaks profoundly to us in the present, and also speaks to many different aspects of our lives, I've been inviting people into conversation, poets and translators, but also teachers and artists of many different kinds, to explore just a handful of verses, 2 or 3 verses that we come to together, to open up some of these wonderful poems and to show not only how relevant they are, but how they can awaken thoughts, new thoughts within each of us. My guest today is the painter Pam Ingalls, who is one of the most extraordinary painters that I've had the privilege of knowing. She is a painter who loves to paint how light falls on ordinary people in ordinary life, and on ordinary things or objects that we might find in our ordinary lives, and on ordinary scenes that we might see in the world around us, and in so doing reveal something of the extraordinary in all of these things that we might take as being ordinary. She has a wonderful description of her own work that I'd like to share with you, because I think it's particularly beautiful. She writes, "I paint simple things, the things I see, am attached to and love. Every subject contains an essence that belongs to just that moment. I get to be with that feeling while I translate it into the poetry of paint. As I become more aware, I keep learning that truth is everywhere. Painting is my way to see and tell the truth. I hope that I'll inspire others to look twice at the beauty of their everyday lives and to find their own way of expressing that." So it's really my great honor to be here today with Pam Ingalls. Pam, thank you so much for being here.
Wow, what an honor, and how great to hear those words from your voice. Thank you for having me. And really, this is such an impressive project. I'm really thrilled to be even a little bit of a part of it. So
Well, I'm
thanks.
thrilled to have you as a part of this. Just to explain to those watching and listening, what I've done is I've given one of the chapters. The book has 133 chapters, each of which deals with some specific aspect of life. And so I sent Pam the chapter called Reading Faces, which is really about how we come to note what people may be thinking or feeling around us, not necessarily expressing out loud, but things that we can come to sense through their eyes, through their gestures, through their way of being in our presence. In the original context, this chapter has to do with how a leader chooses advisors. And the underlying principle is that a leader, in choosing a circle of advisors, and these would traditionally be poet advisors, poet scholars, that the leader should be looking for people who have this capacity to see how people's minds, or rather their hearts and minds, are moving in the silence behind their eyes, behind their faces, if you will. And of course, as all of the poems in this book really do, we can look at them in that more specific context or archetypal context, but we can also see how those poems may speak to us in our own experience. It may help us to recognize, for instance, our own ability to see what someone may be thinking, what somebody may be feeling before us, by a gesture, by a glint in their eye, by all of those things that we learn to see when we learn to see. And so I thought it would be marvelous to explore some of these poems with a painter whose work moves me quite deeply, and whose own work, in my experience of it, helps us to see more of what we see. And it's that more that I'm interested and excited to explore. So my first question, really, for Pam, is, looking at these verses, what verse sort of stood out to you the first time you were reading them?
I have to admit that a lot of the verses kind of went over my head, but the ones that I really connected with were number 706 and number 707. I really
Lovely.
loved those, actually.
Let's start with maybe 706, perhaps.
Perfect.
Um, I'll read the translation so everybody can hear it. And in fact, I think I remember the tummer for this one also, so I'll share that too so people can hear the original language. And I'll read the translation again just so we can be, so to speak, on the same page. The verse goes like this. This is the 6th of the 10 verses in the chapter on reading faces. A crystal reflects its neighbors, as a face the fullness of one's heart. அடுத்தது காட்டும் பளிங்கு போல் நெஞ்சம் கடத்தது காட்டும் முகம். A crystal reflects its neighbors, as a face the fullness of one's heart. I'm curious, Pam, how that may reflect or resonate or connect with your own experience as somebody who has spent a lot of time looking not only closely but very lovingly, I think, at people's faces.
Yeah, well, I think everybody, when they see a face, not just me who's painted a lot of faces, everybody sees something deeper in the first person that they see, that whoever they're looking at. There's some depth that you can see. We know right away. Like, for instance, when I'm painting and I accidentally make something a little bit off, everyone sees it. I mean, everyone knows. So you have to, I have to be very kind of specific about what that particular face is showing. So I have to look kind of deeply, and hopefully, if I'm specific, it will turn into something universal. It's something that other people can see too, can relate to. And I think that's what this little verse said to me, like a crystal reflects everything around it. I think we all reflect what's going on inside us and outside us. That's what I saw.
That's so beautiful. Listening to you speak about the importance of those finest of details, that, it may be just a little thing, but that little bit that's off, we notice it. We may not even notice exactly what we're noticing, but we sense it, we feel it. And that's interesting to me as a translator, because in translating these poems, I've had to spend so much time, in this case, listening to the details of each of these poems, to the details in the original language, and also to the details in the English I'm trying to infuse with some quality of the poem. And so, even a syllable too many, or a syllable too harsh, or in some cases a syllable too soft, we sort of can tell, even if we don't know what it is that we're sensing. And so I can really appreciate that sense of what I think is an artist's discipline or calling, which is to be to have the patience and the discipline and the willingness to really be with each detail in an open-hearted and generous sort of way, so that as all those details accrue, then the whole shines with some quality of that looking, some quality of that seeing. And I'm not by any means any expert at looking at paintings. I feel often out of my own element in the world of the visual arts, but I do know when I feel drawn to a painting. I do know when I feel moved by something in a painting. And I think it has to do with what you were just talking about. It has to do with the painter's attention, the quality of the painter's attention to those small details.
Right. I also liked in this little verse that the idea that a face emits the fullness of one's heart. So to me, that meant not just not just the fullness. Maybe that's for the next verse too, but it shows your face. Our faces really do show what we're feeling, what's going on inside us. And if you know that face well, especially, you can see just a hint that there's something going on there, and you want to ask, or you want to find out. So I guess the writer was saying it would be good if you could read those things.
Yes.
You'd be a good leader.
Oh my gosh. I mean, you'd be a good leader, you'd be a good lover, a good
Yeah,
husband,
that's
a good
right.
wife, a good, a good parent, all
Yeah.
of these, a good teacher, all of these things is that there's so much that that our faces may telegraph or convey. And I love this sense of sort of coming out or emanating. Um, sometimes people have a view of the world in which sort of the face is sort of an opaque thing and the light falls upon it. And at one level of optics, I suppose that's partly true. But there's also the sense in which there is a way in which we come through our faces or our emotional lives, our thoughts, our feelings, our aspirations, our dreams come through in the way that the corner of our mouth may turn, or the
Mhm.
way the corner of our eye in tandem with our mouth may turn. And I love there is a line from Henry David Thoreau in Walden where he says, I don't have the exact line, but it's something like, I've never once looked at the face of someone who is truly awake. How could I
Uh,
look at it? And the sense is that the face would be so bright because it would emanate a kind of light. And we find this language in religious and spiritual traditions of many kinds. The sense that light doesn't just fall on us, but we also emit or share or express or impart certain kinds of light as a metaphor, or maybe an actual experience of that, the inner life, our inner experience being expressed outwardly.
yeah, that makes me think of the moment when we pass away and
Hmm.
how we really know that, you know, they're not, the person isn't there anymore. And whether it's just their face, their spirit, something, whatever it is, they're, it's gone.
It's
And you
true.
know it immediately.
Yes. And you could look at it and it's not really a different face because, one could talk oneself into thinking it's the same face. And yet
Yeah.
anyone who's been in such an experience knows that there's something different. There's some unnameable difference that we feel, that we sense, that aliveness, that life, soul or spirit, to use some of the older words, is just not present there anymore.
Yeah.
And that in turn reminds us of what it means to be with each other as we're alive, and how that to be alive to each other's presence, as it expresses itself through the way we look at each other.
Yeah, maybe that the thing that's gone is what he was saying in the fullness of one's heart. That's what's gone.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful.
Wow.
It's interesting. There's one more thing that I think of with this verse is that I've often thought of the different verses in this book, and there's 133 chapters. There's 1,330 of these verses. So there's lots of verses. And at some paradoxical, poetic level, each verse is like one of these crystals. Like each verse, in a way, reflects all the other verses, those immediately around it, but also those sort of in the larger sphere of the work. And so that one can learn to read or listen to the verses in such a way that you start to hear or see or sense them reflecting the fullness of the other verses around them, which is part of my own experience of poetry, at least of this kind of poetry. And it's exciting for me to imagine or to invite myself, if you will, to experience looking at a painting or looking at a person's a loved one's face with that sense of that face reflecting and emanating their entire lives, their experience, the people that they love, and so that each person becomes, in a way, a kind of um, uh, invitation or doorway or um, reflection of the greater whole that we're all a part of.
Mm, lovely. Wow.
And so beautiful.
Yeah.
You mentioned also the verse that comes right after, which I think is an interesting, and I mean, this is a pretty good example, I think, of how these verses. So here's the verse right next to it. So
Yeah.
somebody reading through the book would be, and so these verses would sort of start to chime together, or they might reflect each other. So I'm curious how these two verses might, in fact, do that, might reflect each other. And I'll read here just the translation. This is verse 7 from the chapter on reading faces. And it says simply this. I'll read it twice so we can listen to it once without worrying about the words so much and just enjoy the sounds of the words. I find it takes a little bit of pressure off if you know that it's not the only time. The poet says, "What is more wise than a face? It puts forth rage and wonder. What is more wise than a face? It puts forth rage and wonder." What struck you about that verse when you first read it?
I love that he didn't just, well, so many of our pieces of art, whether it's painting or poetry, it has to have both. It has to show at least a hint of the shadow as well as the light, of the person or of the poem, of the subject. And so I love um, that he included rage,
Yeah.
with wonder. And what a great juxtaposition, rage and wonder. It's not really the opposite. I mean, maybe it is. I had never thought of that before. But I liked that. And I really do think that the face shows it. That being said, at the same time, some people can just hold their faces perfect and you still can see a hint of it. If you're depending, I suppose, who you are. And also you can just meet a person just for a second, like somebody walking by you in the airport or something. And you can, if you look, you can read them, you can see what's inside their heart, whether it's rage or wonder or whatever. Everybody sees it, even if you try to hide it. So that's what um, thought of when I read that. And I was actually really glad that he put in that. That's a challenge for me in my own work, to put in, well, of course, if I think of it literally, the light and the shadow, that's no problem. But the painting sometimes comes up with something, it surprises me sometimes. I hope it surprises the other person too, the person seeing it, that maybe it's a beautiful person, but there's something else going on in the portrait, or just the opposite, like painting somebody who is an outcast in some way. I did a whole series of people that were street people, and finding the beauty in that, just the difference. Something about that juxtaposition of the shadow and the light in the person, in society, in life, makes it more real to me.
Yes, I I think that that's one of the things that really strikes me too about this poem is how, you know the rage, even to name this powerful emotion, just like wonder is such a powerful emotion, so that they're sort of juxtaposed, but they're also akin in the sense of the energy that they can emit, the energy of rage, or that energy of wonder and awe, of being awe struck or inspired, and how that can, one can even be sort of awestruck and inspired by things that are not as pleasant, or might, somebody who is raging away can be an awesome in the older sort of meaning of that word, just as something that is beatific or magnificent or beautiful some way can evoke that sense of wonder. And I love that the whole that that both of these and the sort of whole range that these both bring to our mind are present. And I think it is something, I was thinking as you were speaking about how, when we look at a great painting, a great portrait, we really are being invited to see, a whole life story, or the whole life story of a single moment,
Mhm.
if you will, uh, unfolding, and that there is something powerful about being seen in our wholeness, our shadow and our light, our kindness and even our cruelty, or our capacity that we all have to be enraged,
Mhm.
and maybe legitimately so, right? And that there's a kind of vision which allows for that wholeness, and somehow that wholeness is healing. I think is um, an act of compassion, if you will. Uh, I don't know if that. I'm curious about your own experience with painting. How do you what does it feel like when you're sitting with someone, or sitting with the image of someone and painting? I mean, it must be very interesting. I mean, I'm just guessing, but I imagine it's a very interesting and form of intimacy that you probably have to have with your subject to really be able to paint them.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think when I'm deciding who to paint or what to paint, that's when I get inspired. And maybe it's like that with poetry. I don't know. So I put down my first guess or my first ideas about the painting, and then it becomes technical. Like what is that shape? What is this? What is that? And like I think I just said, sometimes the best ones, the ones where I look behind me and say, did I do that? The ones that really work happen just really fast, like a composer that says, oh, he wrote that song in the shower, something like that, where it's almost like I didn't paint it, I just was there. But most of the time it's some work to it, of just uh, correcting and taking out what doesn't need to be there and all those kind of things, which it must be for writers too.
Oh yeah, I even just doing this translation,
Oh,
there are those
yeah.
moments when you get a kind of, some little hint, like, oh, this is the way forward. This is the whole thing in a nutshell. And then there's the work. There's
Right.
the technical piece. How do I get these words? I got, 5 out of the 6 words are right. Now I got to find the 6th word, and I might spend a week or a month waiting, knocking on doors. Are you the 6th word?
Yeah.
Are you my missing bit? And yet there's also this strange experience sometimes with something that, with my own work as a poet or as a writer, or the translation like this, you work and you work, and then there's a flash.
Yes.
And it's like all of that work prepared for is in some more complicated way connected to that sort of flash of knowing, and there it is. And the flash is sometimes so strangely effortless. So there's this strange and paradoxical relationship between discipline and technique and practice, and not effort, and not, and receptivity, or openness, or just being there at at the right time and the right place. And it's interesting, too, what you're speaking about, how we all have this capacity to, even in a glance, we see someone, and in a moment, we may know things about them, or sense things about them, or have certain memories of our own awakened by this person. And that made me think about how, a great painting is such an interesting thing, because it is, once it's painted, it's static. And yet, it is, I don't experience a great painting as static, because it's as if in that moment is this whole set, this whole upwelling of moments. Whether it's a life story, whether it's the emotional impact of some traumatic or significant or glorious life event, whatever it may be, there's some paradoxical relationship between that moment and eternity, and that, time and more than time. Same, just as with a poem, I think there's some paradoxical relationship between this small number of words and the more that these words can evoke and express.
Yeah. Oh man, that's beautiful. That's fabulous, Tom. I there was something else that you said earlier that I wanted to comment on, the thing where you're being seen and how important that is, because one of the best compliments I've ever gotten uh, for a show, for something, a painting that I did, was I did a series of refugees, mostly Syrian refugees, but from all over the place in Chicago. And one of the people, these people were people that weren't seen really, they're in the background. And they said to me that they felt seen. And I just kind of went, whoa, to be able to to have a way to make somebody be seen is such a gift for both of us, really. And also for them to be open enough to let me see them.
Yeah.
And especially people, maybe women especially, that weren't really allowed to be seen in their own country. So it was a powerful moment, and I feel really lucky. And that feels like sort of what you were saying, that to be seen is a beautiful thing. It's really scary, I think,
Yes.
for some people. And also it's scary for me too, because I might not catch it, you
Yeah.
never know. You never know. One other thing I wanted to say about paintings and them being static. I don't understand it. And I've been a painter for decades, but the painting is static. It doesn't change. And yet when you look at it another time, or you put it in another place with a different light on it, it's different. And you react to it differently. So, and I'm sure that's the same with poetry, and the same with great novels, or, you read War and Peace when you're 25, and then you read it when you're 45, and you see it completely differently. So that's kind of the magic of art, maybe.
I I definitely agree. That's so beautifully and well put. In fact, it's so well put. I had a thought that I was going to talk about, and it flew out of my head listening to that and just sitting with that. So beautifully spoken. Hmm. Well, this is a great time to ask. Are there any questions that you have about any of these other verses, or about what it's my own experience translating a work like this?
Oh my gosh, I have no idea how you do this. I just, it seems total, like a blur. Um, uh, I You could pick any of those other verses in that chapter, and I wouldn't have. Well, I didn't know what they meant. Um, let's see, like the jewel on the earth of undying seas, he who sees and notes the unsaid. I can keep it on a certain level. I can understand it a little bit, but I don't really know what he's talking about.
I don't really know either. I mean, I've been sitting with this poem for 20 years and I'm still not exactly sure. But that one you just shared is one of my favorites. So maybe I'll just share it, and and in fact, it reminds me of that thought which had flitted out of my head. It flew back in through the window, and I'll share that too. So the verse goes like this, and I think I remember the tummer for this also. It's the first verse, and in fact, because it's the first of these 10 verses, it has a certain kind of it's like the first notes of a symphony. It announces something, and is as so may be both important and as you rightfully note, enigmatic. So Traballuer says, "A jewel on the earth of undying seas, he who sees and notes the unsaid." Kurame noki kuriparivan mara nirvaya kani. A jewel on the earth of undying seas, he who sees and notes the unsaid. The way that I've come to think about this verse is that it is about, this image of jewel, of being a kind of precious treasure or a great beauty on the earth in our embodied experience. It connects to this very capacity that you were just talking about, this ability to really witness someone, to see someone, and for them to feel seen. And that seeing is often wordless. Paintings speak to us without words. They sing to us without notes. And that we can say at one level, in the context of our conversation, that a painter is someone who has that jewel-like capacity to see and note, and that noting might be to be note in paint, to record or express or convey through paint or through whatever artistic medium something of that, what they've seen that hasn't perhaps been said by that person, that they might not think to say, they may not even know they have to say, and yet somehow when it's acknowledged, noticed, then that there's a kind of completion, a kind of beautiful completion that comes about. And this ties, in my mind, with what you were talking about, the beautiful experience of someone feeling seen by a painting, by a painter, because I also think there's the experience when we are standing in front of such a painting,
Mhm.
that our own capacity to see is being cultivated, is being encouraged to grow, so that we might look, for instance, at refugees, or at homeless people, or at any outcast from so-called society, and we might see more deeply, more compassionately, more fully than we had before. And so I think the verse, among the innumerable things that such a verse can do, is celebrating this capacity to see, whether in the advisor to a leader, or in a poet, or in a painter.
I like the way, I don't know how it sounded in his language, but the way you put a jewel on the earth of undying seas, he who sees.
Thank you for noticing.
Great.
That's those little
So fun.
details.
Yeah. It's really cool. Good
Oh,
job.
I'm actually so tickled and delighted that you noticed that, because in fact, the poetic technique, the poetic tools, the poetic genius of this particular poet has to do with rhyming sounds, but not where we, in the West at least, in English, expect them to be, maybe at the end of lines, but in between, so that they are little words or little sounds, little syllables that are echoing with each other, just like, a crystal might be echoing or reflecting those little, all of those things around it.
Yeah. Beautiful. Really cool. Really cool.
Well,
Well, but just
thank
one
you.
more
Yeah.
thing.
Yes,
I
please.
just wanted to say that I've heard that a good poem changes you, by experiencing it. And so I'm grateful that you did this and that you asked me and that I got to see and hear and experience this poem, a little bit of this whole huge um, piece. and and I think in some ways, maybe that I don't know yet, um, it's changed me.
Oh, well, that's
Thank you.
so beautiful, and thank you for being open to exploring these verses with me, and even more, for sharing your impressions, your thoughts, your questions. Just as a great poem can change us, I think a great conversation can change us. I will be looking at and listening to these poems in a different way now than I did an hour ago, 2 hours ago, because that, I think, is of the nature of a great poem, and the connection, the conversation, the communion, even, if you will, that such a poem can help engender, and help us help each other to see and sense more deeply. So before we close, I just wanted to let people know that if they are interested to learn more about Pam Ingalls' work, you can visit her website, PamIngalls.com, PAMINGALLS.com. You can look at a portfolio of her work, including, I believe, some of the series that you mentioned, Pam.
Mhm.
It's really it's a beautiful site. It's a beautiful offering to be able to, even without coming to a gallery or an exhibition in person, to glimpse uh, what you are helping us to see. So thank you again so very much, Pam, for for this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. This is really fun.
Lovely.